What do you call a shape of cold stone before dawn? When the sand is still blue-gray, the air tastes dry on your tongue, and a carved face waits for the first thin line of light as if it already knows the sun is coming. That is where you have to begin with the Sphinx. Not in a classroom, not in a tidy caption, but in that hush before morning, when this vast form feels less like an object and more like a presence. A single mass of stone, cut and shaped about 4,500 years ago into a lion's body, human gaze kind of form, and left there to confront every age that came after it. Think about that for a second. One body, one stone drawn out of the earth itself, not assembled piece by piece like a puzzle. And somehow, even now, they still cannot settle the matter around it. They can measure the length, they can study the weathering, they can argue over the maker and debate the purpose, but they still can't fully explain it. And they definitely can't control what it does to people when they stand in its presence. This mystery endures. It is enormous, yes, stretching about 73 meters, older than almost anything people casually imagine when they say the word ancient. But size is not the deepest thing about it. Plenty of big things become ordinary once they are cataloged. This one does not. This one keeps slipping through the fingers of explanation. Was it royal power in stone? A marker? A warning? A guardian? The records do not close the case. The theories do not silence the questions. And the more they try to reduce it to one fixed answer, the more the riddle none could solve seems to rise again. What makes it even stranger is this. For most of recorded history, it did not stand clean and fully revealed the way postcards like to pretend. It spent long ages buried to the shoulders in sand. Imagine only the head and upper form emerging, while whole empires came and went around it. Wind scraping the surface, heat pressing into the stone by day, night cold settling into every carved line. Kingdoms changed, beliefs shifted, languages moved on, and still that face remained, half hidden, half declared, never fully gone. So when you look at it, you are not looking at a ruin that failed. You are looking at something that survived being covered, misread, and claimed by generations that could not contain it. And that is only the first reason this ancient watcher still unsettles the world. If this kind of mystery reaches you, subscribe and leave a like, because what it is facing and why that matters changes everything. And that is where the second layer opens. Because a face half lifted out of warm grit is already strange, but a face turned with intention is stranger still. This stone guardian does not stare randomly across the desert. It is set facing the rising sun, due east. The first light comes in low, thin, and pale, brushing the edge of the cheek, the brow, the worn lines around the mouth. On the equinox, when day and night stand in balance, that alignment becomes even more exact. Now, you need to feel what that means. They can call it orientation, they can call it design, they can call it ritual planning. But none of those neat words can fully contain what happens when a monument this old is waiting on dawn with that kind of precision. It is no longer just a carved mass. It becomes timing. It becomes attention. It becomes a witness placed where darkness breaks. And that matters because people who want control always trust clocks, schedules, and systems they built with their own hands. This form answers to something older. The light reaches it whether empires approve or not. The horizon keeps its appointment whether records survive or not. That is why the thing unsettles people more than they admit. A structure can be owned. A symbol can be repurposed. A ruin can be explained away. But something facing the rising sun for age after age carries a rhythm they can observe and still not command. They cannot force dawn to arrive, and they cannot make this old watcher stop receiving it. That is a kind of authority the world has trouble dealing with. You may have noticed that the more fixed it seems, the less passive it feels. That is the mystery. It has no steps, no moving parts, no voice in the ordinary sense, and still it behaves like a participant in a greater order. Morning after morning, season after season, sand blowing against the stone, air cooling before sunrise and heating fast after it, the same act continues. Alignment. And if a thing can remain still and yet stay perfectly placed for what matters most, then maybe stillness is not weakness at all. Maybe stillness is how certain truths refuse to be pulled off course. This is why the Sphinx has never been only about age or size. A monument that large could have faced anywhere, but this one keeps its attention on the place where light returns. And once you see that, the next question will not leave you alone. Why would a being with a lion's body, human gaze, be set to greet balance itself? Once you notice that alignment, another tension starts pressing on you. Because a form placed that carefully should come with a clear explanation, and this one does not. That is one of the reasons it keeps unsettling people. A monument this immense ought to arrive with a settled name, a settled maker, a settled purpose. You would think the stone would have surrendered that by now. You would think time would have given up the answer cleanly, like dust shaken from a cloth. But no, the builder is still argued over. The purpose is still argued over. Was it carved to project royal authority? Was it meant to guard a sacred zone? Was it bound to the sun in a way we only partly understand? Every answer reaches toward it, and still, something remains outside the grasp. They can point, compare, debate, draw lines from one theory to another, but they still cannot close their hand around the whole thing. And that matters more than people admit, because when something this visible stays unresolved, it exposes the limits of the system that wants everything labeled and filed away. This is not a tiny fragment lost in darkness. This is a giant in open air. Wind moving over its back, heat pressing into its flanks at noon, fine dust settling in the grooves of the face. It has been standing there, plain before the eyes, and still it resists ownership. That is rare. They are comfortable with mystery when it is far away, buried deep, or broken into pieces. But this one is right there. You can trace its outline. You can feel the scale of it in your chest. And even then, the final answer does not come. That is why the riddle none could solve is not only in the stone itself, but in what the stone does to human certainty. It forces a confession most people hate to make. Not everything yields on command. Not everything old becomes simple once enough eyes have stared at it. Some things remain whole by refusing to be reduced. And you know what? That resistance carries its own authority. The world does not like what it cannot fully decode, because what it cannot decode, it also cannot fully control. So when you stand before this watcher in your mind, you are not just standing before age. You are standing before unanswered intention, before a will cut into rock and left there so long that centuries became weather on its skin. And if the maker cannot be settled with certainty, then the next question grows even heavier. What kind of message is so large, so patient, and so exact that it can survive while its author disappears? And that is where the silence around the maker leads you to a harder truth. Sometimes the message outlives the mouth that formed it, and that is exactly what happened here. For long stretches of history, this great watcher was not fully seen at all. The desert kept taking it back. Grain by grain, wind by wind, the sand piled up around the body until the vast form stood buried to the shoulders in sand, with the head and upper chest emerging above the drift. You need to picture that properly. The lower mass hidden, the lion stretch of the body swallowed. Only the face, weathered and patient, looking out over a landscape that kept changing names. Warm dust clinging in the carved lines, dry air humming softly in the ears, sunlight bleaching the stone by day, cold settling into it after dusk. And through all of that, it remained visible, just enough to trouble the imagination. That partial visibility is one of its deepest powers. A thing fully revealed can be handled too quickly. People think they understand what they can see all at once. But this form did not offer itself that way. It gave generations only a portion, enough to inspire reverence, enough to provoke stories, enough to keep the question alive. That matters, because what is half hidden often reaches deeper into the mind than what is completely displayed. They could not walk around the whole body for much of recorded memory. They could not take in the full outline in a single glance. They met it as a presence interrupted by the earth itself. And still, even with most of it concealed, it could not be ignored, could not be explained away, and could not be controlled. There is something else in that. Burial usually suggests defeat. It suggests loss, abandonment, forgetting. But not here. Here, concealment became endurance. The sand did not erase the figure. It preserved its tension. It kept the world from treating the whole thing as ordinary. While powers rose and faded around it, this one remained in a strange state. Hidden but not gone. Restrained but not broken. Covered but still watching. That makes it feel so personal when you look at it in your mind. You know the difference between being unseen and being absent. This ancient form knew it too. Once you understand that the body could disappear beneath the desert while the face still held its place, another realization begins to press on you. What if the part that remained visible was the part the world was always meant to confront first? And that is exactly where the face begins to matter more than the hidden body. Because when the sand leaves you only the head to meet, the eyes become the whole event. For ages, people did not first encounter the long back, the stretched paws, the full sweep of the form. They met the upper part, the brow catching light, the nose line broken by time, the mouth holding that unreadable calm. Dust gathered in the shallow cuts. Wind hissed past the stone. Morning light slid across one side while the other kept its shadow a little longer. And in that half-revealed state, the watcher did something very few monuments can do. It made people project themselves onto it. Some saw wisdom. Some saw judgment. Some saw royal power. Some saw warning. The same face, the same silence, and every age came carrying a different answer. That is not a small thing. When a form can hold many meanings without collapsing into nonsense, you are no longer dealing with decoration. You are dealing with a presence strong enough to receive projection without being reduced by it. They want symbols to behave like labels. One meaning, one function, one approved interpretation. But this old guardian does not cooperate. It absorbs certainty and sends it back thinner than it arrived. So the face feels almost unnervingly alive, even in stillness. It does not tell you what to think. It makes you aware that you are already thinking, already reaching, already revealing yourself in the way you try to explain it. And this is where you need to notice something personal. A hidden body with a visible face teaches a hard truth. Sometimes, what the world sees first is not your full design, only the part of you strong enough to remain above the drift. That does not make the buried part unreal. It means the deeper structure is carrying more than anyone can measure from the surface. This ancient figure understood that long before people found words for it. Its strength did not depend on being fully available. Its authority did not wait for complete exposure. Even half concealed, it could not be dismissed. Even weathered, it could not be made ordinary. That is why the lion's body, human gaze, still works on people. Not because every detail is intact, and not because every question is answered, but because the visible portion feels like a challenge. It asks what force can remain recognizable after so much concealment, and what truth keeps looking back after centuries of dust. Once you realize that the face itself became a threshold, another door opens. Because this is no longer only about stone, but about what human beings have always believed such a guardian is standing in front of. And that is the shift you cannot miss. The moment this old face stops feeling like a statue and starts feeling like a threshold. Across cultures, forms like this keep returning. Not always in the same stone, not always with the same features, but with the same pressure behind them. A watcher at the edge, a guardian near the crossing, a presence placed where one state ends and another begins. That is why this figure carries more than local meaning. Its power does not stay trapped in one patch of desert or one chapter of history. The shape itself keeps speaking. A creature with lion's body, human gaze, does not belong to ordinary categories. It stands between force and thought, instinct and rule, earth and idea. And whenever human beings build or remember such a form, they are confessing something very old, that the most important places in life are gates. That is what makes this guardian so difficult to domesticate. They want to turn it into a solved symbol, something safe and settled, something that can be explained once and then filed away. But a true threshold never works like that. A threshold is not there to flatter you. It is there to test whether you are ready to pass. And the form before the desert dawn keeps carrying that exact weight. The worn cheeks, the broad chest line, the sand-scored surface, the silence that hangs around the mouth. All of it says the same thing without saying a word. Not everyone approaches mystery in the same condition, and what you bring to it shapes what you receive. This is why the old image has lasted where other meanings faded. Guardian figures endure because people keep living the same inner reality. You still come to borders in your own life. You still stand at moments where one way of being must end before another can begin. You still meet places where strength alone is not enough, and intelligence alone is not enough. That is why this one still feels alive to you. It carries a pattern your spirit recognizes. Not because you can explain every layer of it, but because some truths are older than language and harder to control than systems would like. So no, this is not only a relic. It is a warning sign, a witness mark, a keeper of passage. And once you start seeing it that way, the sand, the silence, even the unresolved purpose begin to feel less like missing pieces and more like part of the design. Because if this form stands at a gate, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What was it guarding so fiercely that even time could not persuade it to step aside? And that is where the guardian image stops being ancient decoration and starts becoming a mirror. Because gates do not only protect what is behind them, they reveal who is standing before them. The old form has never meant just one thing to everyone who meets it. A true guardian does not hand out the same experience to every set of eyes. It answers the approach. If you come looking for a trophy, you see stone. If you come looking for certainty, you meet silence. If you come with reverence, patience, and the willingness to be unsettled, then the figure begins to open in a different way. Not by speaking, not by moving, but by exposing what was already active in you. That is one of the oldest powers of a threshold presence. It does not merely stand there. It tests the heart without touching it. And this is exactly why people keep trying to shrink such a form into something simpler. They would rather say, it means this and only this. They would rather pin it down with one approved answer and move on. Because once a guardian remains larger than explanation, it also remains larger than control. And people who live by control are deeply uncomfortable with anything that refuses to behave like a closed case. This old watcher does not flatter that need. It stands with the same worn face, the same heavy stillness, and lets human beings reveal themselves in the act of interpretation. It keeps its power even after damage, even after sand, even after centuries of argument. They can debate it. They cannot domesticate it. You may already feel why this matters to you. Some presences in the world do not chase attention, yet they expose the quality of attention around them. This one is like that. It does not have to move toward you to affect you. It simply remains what it is. And because it remains, it separates shallow curiosity from real hunger. It is authority so settled it does not need to perform. The same stone that kept its place through wind and burial now keeps another kind of place. Inside the human imagination. Inside the part of you that knows certain realities are not meant to be handled casually. So when people call it a mystery, they are only partly right. It is also an instrument, a filter, a line in the soul. It lets one person walk away with a photo and another walk away disturbed, strengthened, or strangely recognized. Once you accept that this guardian is measuring more than distance, the next realization comes in quietly. Maybe what it was guarding was never only a place, but a kind of truth that not everyone is ready to face. And that is why the question of what it guards begins to turn inward. Because the longer you stay with this old sentinel, the less it feels like it is defending treasure, and the more it feels like it is defending a way of seeing. Look at the form itself in your mind. Stone warmed all day by the sun, cooling slowly after dusk. Fine grit settled in the cracks, the broad outline holding steady while the sky changes color above it. Nothing about that presence feels hurried. Nothing about it feels eager to impress. It simply remains. And that may be the very thing under protection here. In a world that keeps trying to turn every mystery into a product, every sacred thing into a caption, every silence into something to be filled, this watcher preserves another possibility. It says that not everything exists for quick use. Not everything holy arrives with a label attached. Some realities must be approached, not consumed. Some meanings open only to patience. So the form still resists explanation. It is refusing to be handled carelessly. This is where people often misunderstand a guardian. They imagine it is posted there only to keep intruders out. But many guardians also keep something alive. They protect a standard. They hold a boundary so a deeper order is not swallowed by noise. This one does exactly that. Its silence keeps reverence alive. Its age keeps perspective alive. Its unresolved meaning keeps humility alive. They may not like hearing that, because humility is hard for systems built on certainty. But it does not bend to that demand. It keeps asking for a slower kind of attention, the kind that listens before it names, the kind that can feel truth without needing to own it. And maybe that is why you are drawn to it more than you can explain. Not because you have all the answers, but because some part of you is tired of flat meanings and borrowed certainty. Some part of you recognizes that the world becomes thinner when everything is forced into categories too quickly. This guardian stands against that thinning. It keeps depth from collapsing into convenience. It keeps wonder from being trained out of the human spirit. That is no small task. In its own motionless way, it has held that line for ages. So if it has been guarding anything this whole time, perhaps it has been guarding the part of you that still knows how to stand before mystery without trying to conquer it. And once you see that, the next realization arrives with even greater force. Because a presence like this does not rule by movement, but by something far more unsettling. And that force is silence. Not empty silence, not the silence of absence, but the kind that presses back without lifting a finger. You can feel it in the image of the old guardian even without standing near the stone. No speech, no command, no raised banner. Just the long stillness of a form that has watched light arrive, sand gather, shadows move, and ages pass. Most things people call powerful are loud about it. They announce themselves. They demand notice. They keep proving and proving and proving. This one never needed that. The worn face, the heavy chest line, the unmoving outline against open sky, all of it says the same thing. What is truly established does not beg to be believed. That is why it unsettles people. They know how to answer noise. They know how to challenge arguments. They know how to resist pressure. But a presence that does not argue and still does not move, that is much harder to control. This is where the deeper authority begins to show itself. Not the kind handed out by a title, not the kind borrowed from a crowd. The old sentinel carries a weight that does not depend on approval. It remained what it was while stories changed around it. It remained while explanations fought with one another. It remained while time took its share from the surface and still failed to empty the center. That kind of authority cannot be manufactured. They may try to frame it, market it, summarize it, make it safe for easy consumption. But the stillness keeps refusing them. The form does not chase relevance. Relevance keeps circling back to it. And if you are hearing this deeply, then you already know why this matters. Some truths in you work the same way. They do not need endless defense to be real. They do not need performance to carry weight. The world often trains people to think that if they are not constantly announcing themselves, they are disappearing. But this ancient watcher says otherwise. It says rooted things can wait. It says presence can outlast explanation. It says what is aligned does not need to panic. That is why those who live by control feel uneasy around silence like this. They cannot steer what does not react on demand. Listen closely to what this monument teaches simply by remaining in place. Silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is the sign that a thing has gone deeper than argument. Sometimes it is the final refusal to be reduced. And once you understand that its greatest statement may be the fact that it does not speak at all, then you are ready for the next mystery, because time itself has been speaking through that stone in a way most people never notice. And time has been speaking through it with a patience no human voice could sustain. You can see it in the surface, the edges softened by centuries of wind, the grain of the stone holding heat through the day, then releasing it into the cool dark, the marks of weather, burial, exposure, repair, and endurance all resting on the same body at once. This is not the kind of survival that pretends nothing happened. The old guardian carries what happened openly. It has been worn, covered, revealed again, looked at by generations who came and left without settling its meaning. And still, it remains legible as presence. That is what makes time's testimony so powerful here. Time did not erase it. Time edited it, pressed on it, tested it, and the core still stands. That kind of endurance does something to the human mind. It breaks the spell of temporary power. Every age likes to imagine that its own systems are permanent, that its own categories will hold forever, that its own language is the final frame. Then, this watcher sits there, older than their certainties, and quietly outlasts them. By remaining, not by fighting or arguing. That is why people feel so unsettled around ancient things that still carry force. They expose how quickly noise fades. They expose how fragile human control can be. The surface changes, yes, sand covers, wind scours, but something in the center refuses collapse. And listen, that is not small comfort, because there is a kind of strength that does not come from never being touched by time, but from refusing to be emptied by it. This old form shows you that plainly. It does not hide its weathering. It does not deny the long seasons when most of its body was unseen. It does not need perfection to hold authority. In fact, the marks of endurance are part of the authority. They prove that presence can survive pressure. They prove that meaning can persist even when the original voice is gone. They prove that what is real does not have to stay pristine in order to stay powerful. That is why the old sentinel becomes more than an artifact when you truly look at it. It becomes a witness against panic, against the fear that if time touches something, time owns it. Time touched this stone deeply, and still could not claim the final word. They can measure erosion. They can describe phases. They can build theories around stages and layers, but they still cannot fully explain why the force of it remains. And once you understand that time has not only worn this guardian, but revealed it, then you are ready for another layer, because the shape itself carries a message no amount of measurement can exhaust. And that message begins with the body itself, because this guardian was never shaped as a simple animal, and never shaped as a simple person either. It is a joining, a fusion. The long strength of the lion beneath, the human face above, all carved into one continuous form. You do not have to force that image to feel its power. Even before anyone explains a single theory, your senses understand that you are looking at a union of different kinds of authority. The broad stone body speaks of grounded force, weight, readiness, command over territory. The face speaks of awareness, judgment, intention, the power to see and not merely react. That combination matters. Strength alone can become blind. Intelligence alone can become fragile. But here, in the dry light and wind-cut surface, they are bound together. That is part of why the old figure keeps resisting neat interpretation. They would prefer one lane, one approved meaning, one safe category. But this form does not stay in one lane. It holds instinct and consciousness in the same body. It makes you look at force that is not mindless and thought that is not weak. It offers a wholeness that the modern habit of dividing everything into pieces struggles to handle. They can describe the carved face, they can describe the animal frame, but they still cannot fully explain what happens when those two realities are joined into one silent presence that has outlasted ages. And maybe that is why it keeps striking something so deep in you. Because you know what it is to feel split by the world's categories. Be this, not that. Choose one mode. Shrink one part so another part can be tolerated. But this guardian does not shrink. It does not apologize for carrying more than one dimension of power at once. In the same body, it holds stillness and force, patience and command, earthly weight and symbolic height. That is not confusion. That is integration. That is why it cannot be cheaply explained, and that is why it cannot be easily controlled. When sand covered much of it, that union remained true. When weather marked the face, that union remained true. When meaning shifted across centuries, that union remained true. The body kept saying what the records could not settle. Real authority does not come from being one-dimensional. It comes from being fully formed, even when others only understand a fraction of what stands before them. So now the question changes again. Beyond who carved it, beyond only what it guarded, to why human beings, across long stretches of time, kept returning to this very kind of shape whenever they wanted to speak about power that must not be violated. Because once a culture chooses this form for a guardian, it is confessing something enormous. And what that confession points to is impossible to ignore. A culture does not choose this kind of guardian unless it believes power must be more than force. This is where the figure stops being a puzzle of stone alone and becomes a statement about what human beings fear, honor, and protect most. A lion's body says there is real strength in the world, weight, command, the ability to hold ground. A human face says strength must answer to awareness. Put those together, and the message becomes difficult to escape. Power without wisdom is dangerous. Wisdom without strength is exposed. This guardian holds both in one body, as if to say that what stands at the boundary must be able not only to resist, but to discern. That is why the shape keeps returning in human memory. Not because people lack imagination, but because they keep arriving at the same truth from different directions. And that truth unsettles modern habits of thinking more than most people realize. They like clean divisions, mind over here, matter over there, symbol on one side, structure on the other. But this old presence refuses those splits. It is stone and meaning at once. Animal force and reflective stillness at once. Monument and question at once. They can study the measurements, the weathering, the line of the face, the stretch of the body. All of that matters. But the more they try to reduce the whole thing to isolated pieces, the more the whole escapes them. It cannot be fully explained because its power lives in the joining. This figure keeps speaking to the side of you that is tired of fragmentation. You know what it feels like when the world asks you to divide yourself into acceptable pieces. Be useful, but not deep. Be thoughtful, but not strong. Be spiritual, but not grounded. Be powerful, but easy to manage. This guardian rejects that bargain simply by existing. It has endured precisely because it does not separate what was meant to remain whole. That is part of why it cannot be controlled. A divided thing is easy to steer. An integrated thing is much harder to move against its nature. So when you look at this weathered form, you are not only seeing an ancient design choice, you are seeing an argument carved into the earth. An argument that says true authority is not thin. It is not one note. It is not fragile. It is made of joined realities that lesser systems prefer to keep apart. And once you recognize that the shape itself is teaching wholeness, another tension appears. Because the more people study it, the more obvious it becomes that facts alone still do not exhaust its hold on the human spirit. And that is where the difference between studying a thing and possessing it becomes impossible to ignore. You can measure the length. You can map the stone. You can trace the weathering, note the damage, argue the dates, compare the shape, and still come away with something unfinished in your hands. The facts are not useless. The body matters. The age matters. The alignment matters. The long burial matters. Every real detail gives you more ground to stand on. But ground is not the same as completion. This old guardian keeps proving that a thing can be materially known and still spiritually uncontained. That is the part they struggle with. They are comfortable as long as knowledge feels like ownership. They become uneasy the moment knowledge reveals its own limit. And look at how perfectly this form exposes that limit. It is not hidden in a cave. It is not scattered in fragments across unreachable terrain. It stands where eyes can meet it. The lines of the face, the massive body, the worn stone, the silence around it. All of it is available to observation. Yet observation does not finish the encounter. You can describe it and still not absorb it. You can stand before it and still not have the final key. That is why it keeps working on people. The old figure reminds you that explanation is not the same thing as mastery, and contact is not the same thing as possession. That truth is precious, especially now, because the world keeps training people to think that if something can be analyzed, it has been exhausted. If it can be named, it has been contained. If it can be viewed, it has been fully received. But this guardian stands against that illusion. It says there are realities you can approach honestly, learn from deeply, and still not own. Not because truth is hiding from you, but because truth, larger than your categories, remains larger after you study it. That is not failure. That is proportion. That is humility with stone in it. And maybe this is why the old monument still reaches you so strongly. It gives permission for mystery without requiring dishonesty. It lets fact and wonder stand in the same place without canceling one another. You do not have to choose between solid ground and deep meaning here. The very form insists on both. That is rare. And because it is rare, it cannot be easily controlled by minds that only trust what they can flatten. So the more carefully you look, the more this one teaches a surprising freedom. That some of the truest things in the world do not become smaller when you understand them better. They become deeper. And once you allow that, another question begins rising from the stone itself. If it cannot be possessed, why does it keep calling people back so powerfully across the ages? And that callback to the stone is not accidental. It rises from a hunger most people do not know how to name, but they feel it the moment they stand near this old form, or even imagine it clearly enough. There is something about this guardian that refuses to let the world become flat. The dry air around it, the pale grit gathering in the carved lines, the huge, still body under open sky, all of it works against the modern habit of turning everything into quick information. You do not come to a presence like this for efficiency. You come because some part of you is tired of surfaces. You come because a life made only of function begins to feel thin. And this old watcher interrupts that thinness. It reminds you that not everything real can be rushed, translated into a slogan, or emptied into a tidy explanation. That is why people keep returning. Not only to see an ancient monument, but to stand near something that has not surrendered its depth. This matters more than people admit. They will say they are interested in history, architecture, symbolism, alignment, and those things are true. But beneath all that, there is often another pull. The form gives human beings permission to feel reverence again. Real reverence. Not forced, not in borrowed language. The kind that quiets the mind for a second and makes you aware that you are in the presence of something older than your categories. That is a rare mercy. The world trains people to treat wonder like weakness and mystery like a problem to solve as fast as possible. This guardian says no. It says depth is not your enemy. Awe is not foolish. The unanswered is not automatically empty. In fact, some of the most life-giving realities stay partly beyond your grasp. And if you are drawn to that, there is nothing small about it. It means some part of you is still alive enough to recognize what cannot be bought, flattened, or controlled. It means you have not fully surrendered to the pressure to make everything useful before you allow it to matter. This old sentinel protects that capacity in you. It keeps alive the part that can stand before greatness without trying to shrink it. The part that can feel meaning before owning language for it. The part that knows truth does not always arrive as a conclusion. Sometimes it arrives as a presence. So the pull reaches beyond the stone itself. It is toward the world that stone proves is still possible. A world where mystery has not been drained out of reality, where silence still carries weight, where guardians still stand. And once you feel that longing clearly, another conflict sharpens into view. Because not everyone wants that kind of world to remain open. And that is the conflict sitting underneath all of this. One world wants mystery reduced, and another world knows mystery is part of how truth stays alive. The Guardian stands right in the middle of that struggle. On one side is the pressure to turn every sacred thing into inventory, measured, packaged, explained just enough to feel safe, then moved along. On the other side is the stubborn fact of a presence that keeps giving more than those methods can hold. The stone stays there under the same sky, carrying age, alignment, silence, weather, image, and unresolved meaning all at once. They can manage the conversation around it for a while. They can decide what is acceptable to say, what counts as serious, what must be pushed aside as unhelpful. But they still cannot make the figure stop exerting its effect. They cannot make it become small just because smallness is easier to manage. So the monument matters far beyond itself. It becomes evidence that reality is not fully flattened yet. There are still forms in the world that resist being turned into pure function. There are still presences that keep depth open. And once you know that, a different kind of courage begins to rise. Because if this stone can remain itself through sand, weather, theories, and time, then maybe you do not have to surrender every part of your own depth just to be accepted by the systems around you. Maybe what they cannot categorize in you is not a defect. Maybe it is the very sign that you still belong to a larger order than the one they prefer. This is exactly why such a figure feels threatening to control even without moving. It reminds people that there are loyalties older than convenience, rhythms older than schedules, truths that do not ask permission from the age. The old sentinel turns to the rising sun whether anyone appreciates that symbolism or not. It carries a joined form, whether simplified thinking likes it or not. It preserves unanswered meaning, whether the impatient mind likes it or not. And in doing so, it keeps opening a crack in the closed world people keep trying to build. So the struggle is not only about one ancient monument. It is about whether the human spirit is still allowed to encounter what cannot be fully explained and cannot be fully controlled without being shamed for it. This guardian has been answering that question for ages, simply by remaining in place. And if that is true, then the next step is not only to admire the stone from a distance, it is to ask what kind of person you become when you finally let a presence like this teach you how to stand. And that lesson begins very simply, by watching how this guardian stands. It does not rush. It does not explain itself into exhaustion. It does not chase approval from the ages passing around it. The stone remains where it was set, carrying weather on its skin and timing in its posture. It faced the dawn long before anyone listening to this was born, and it keeps that orientation without anxiety. That matters, because one of the deepest things this monument teaches is that alignment is stronger than panic. A form set rightly does not need frantic motion to prove it belongs. The world may swirl with noise, sand may rise and fall, theories may multiply, attention may come and go. The watcher keeps its place. That is not passivity. That is disciplined presence. Then there is the lesson of hiddenness. Much of its body was once lost beneath the drift, and still it did not lose itself. That is important for you to hear. Buried seasons do not automatically mean wasted seasons. Concealed is not the same as defeated. The figure proves that something can be covered for a long time and still remain exactly what it is. When the sand held back the full outline, the deeper structure was still there, supporting everything the world could see. That stability is rare, and because it is rare, people often misread it. They mistake quiet endurance for absence. They mistake delayed revelation for weakness. But the stone says otherwise. It says depth can survive invisibility. And then there is the lesson of silence. Not every truth has to defend itself at the volume the age demands. This ancient sentinel carries weight without constant self-announcement. It teaches you that rooted things do not have to beg to be recognized. They can wait. They can endure misunderstanding without collapsing into confusion. They can hold their shape through seasons when others keep trying to define them too quickly. That is why the Guardian feels so strengthening. It does not flatter urgency, it trains steadiness. So if you let this form teach you, it teaches you to remain joined within yourself, to stay turned toward what is real, to survive hidden years without self-betrayal, and to trust that presence can outlast noise. That is a serious education, and one the world does not easily offer. They prefer haste because haste is easier to steer. They prefer exposure without depth because exposure is easier to measure. But this old presence keeps holding another pattern in plain sight. Once you begin to learn from that pattern, something shifts inside the way you see the stone, because it no longer appears only as an ancient survivor. It starts to feel like recognition. And that recognition is the turning point. Because once this old guardian stops being only something you observe, it begins to reveal something about you. You start to see why it stays with you. Because it is ancient. Because it is immense. Because it cannot be fully explained. It stays with you because it carries a pattern your own spirit recognizes. Scarred but still present. Weathered but not emptied. Partly hidden for long stretches, yet never erased. Set in place with purpose, even when generations argued over what that purpose was. That is why the form reaches so deep. It does not merely impress you, it confirms something. It tells you that being misunderstood is not the same as being without meaning. It tells you that passing through long silence does not cancel your design. It tells you that what is real in you can survive burial, delay, and misreading without surrendering its core. This is where their way of seeing begins to fail completely. They look at a thing and assume that if they cannot fully define it, something must be wrong with it. But the Sphinx gives another answer. It stands there as proof that unresolved does not mean empty. Hidden does not mean lost. Worn does not mean weak. Imagine what that does to a person who has spent years being measured by shallow standards. Imagine what it does when you finally realize that some of your strongest seasons may have been the ones where most of your structure was invisible. The stone knew that before you did. It held its place through those seasons without begging to be believed. And this is why the old guardian feels almost personal now. Its silence starts sounding like permission. Its endurance starts feeling like instruction. Its unmoving posture starts exposing how much of the world has been trained to panic, explain, perform, and chase. Meanwhile, this ancient form remains what it is. It does not hurry to prove its value. It does not crumble because every observer sees it differently. It does not collapse because time left marks on the surface. It just keeps facing what it was set to face. If you can receive that, then you can receive the deeper gift too. That your life does not have to become smaller just because other people need simpler categories. You do not have to flatten what was made whole. You do not have to rush what was meant to ripen. You do not have to explain every layer of yourself to those who only trust what they can control. And once that lands in you, the final veil becomes very thin. Because then the question is no longer what this guardian means in history. It becomes what kind of freedom enters a person who finally believes they were never meant to be easily explained at all. And that freedom is the final gift this ancient guardian gives. Not an answer tied up neatly, but a steadiness that survives without one. By the end, the old form has stopped asking you to solve it. It has already outlived too many explanations for that. What it offers instead is a kind of proof. Proof that a thing can stand in full view and still remain greater than the categories pressed upon it. Proof that burial is not disappearance. Proof that weathering is not defeat. Proof that alignment matters more than applause. There it remains, stone warmed by day, cooled by night, carrying age in every line, keeping its watch through silence rather than display. And somewhere in all of that, the fear of being fully decoded begins to loosen. Because this guardian has spent ages refusing to become smaller for the comfort of those who needed a simpler world. That is why the final image matters so much. The image, not the arguments around it or the labels laid over it. Sand lying low after wind. The long body still grounded. The face receiving the early light without hurry. A monument that was once buried to the shoulders in sand, yet never lost its place in the horizon. A form facing the rising sun, not because the age approved, but because that was its orientation from the beginning. And that is the wisdom hidden in plain sight. The dawn does not ask the stone to explain itself before it arrives. It just touches what was already turned the right way. So maybe this is why the old watcher endures across cultures and centuries as the riddle none could solve. Not because it failed to speak clearly, but because it was never meant to be reduced to a single sentence. Some truths are carried the way stone carries warmth after sunset, quietly, long after the source has slipped below the edge of sight. They remain in the body. They remain in the posture. They remain in the fact that something can be scarred, half-hidden, argued over, and still keep faith with the line it was set upon. Then the light climbs a little higher. The shadow shortens along the flank. Fine dust glows pale at the base, and the desert goes still enough that even silence feels shaped. If this message stayed with you, subscribe for what comes next, and leave a comment if this ancient watcher met you somewhere deeper than words usually reach.